to switch gears a little bit though away from energy, transportation, a lot of people don't really realize that the global food system produces 25% or even more of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending on the estimate. And so now we're excited to invite Rebekah Moses, who is the head of impact strategy for Impossible Foods, and Caroline Bushnell, who is the vice president of corporate engagement for the Good Food Institute. So thank you, ladies, so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure, absolutely. So to kick things off here, Impossible Foods launched in 2011 with a really audacious vision to shake up the global food system and dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Rebekah, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this to kick things off.
Absolutely. Well, Impossible Foods was founded to turn back the clock on climate change. That's the business model. We happen to go about doing that by making meat from plants. So here's a little background on that. We all know, and we've heard this whole morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, we're in two emergencies right now. We're in a climate emergency and we're in an extinction emergency, loss of nature, loss of wildlife. And those two things are very, very much related. So there's no way to address them without addressing global meat consumption. You mentioned something in the intro about direct emissions coming from agriculture. The vast majority of that is coming from animal farming, not just agriculture in general, but the land use component of it is as important as those direct emissions. This is probably the most under-acknowledged climate impact area, the land use of livestock, so particularly cattle. It really is catastrophic for our ability collectively to pull and keep carbon out of the atmosphere. So half of the world's surface is grazed or is in feed crop production. That's an incredible erosion, not only of nature, but really a loss of carbon storing vegetation. And that's not even getting into that direct emissions question. So this is the current situation. And over the next several decades, meat consumption is projected to nearly double. What does that mean in terms of our ability to keep, human beings within these planetary thresholds? So very simply, Dr. Pat Brown founded Impossible Foods in 2011 because this is a policy vacuum. It's very, very underaddressed. We have to find ways to get consumers to reduce their reliance on animal farming by eating less meat from animals. And we have to do that drastically, but not by trying to bully or cajole people into changing food practices, because it's pretty ineffective. So just to sum up, we make, as a company at Impossible Foods, we make meat using ingredients from plants, things like soy, sunflower, coconut, and our own iron-carrying ingredient heme. And that is to provide a climate and land use toolkit for consumers so that they don't have to compromise in their food choice, but they can make a sustainable choice. So the Impossible Burger requires 96% less land, about 89% less greenhouse gas emissions results from it. And it's great if consumer knows that, but they don't have to know it to enjoy the product.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And the Good Food Institute is closely tracking the development of alternative proteins, as well as how consumers are feeling about them. So Caroline, I'm wondering if you can kick things off by telling us a little more about who GFI is and what you're seeing out there as far as consumer sentiment around meatless meat alternative protein.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, GFI, or the Good Food Institute, we're a nonprofit 501c3, and we're really focused on reimagining protein for all of the reasons that Rebekah just really wonderfully described. Right. So we're focused on developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just food system. And so to do that, we really focus on alternative proteins as a long-term, durable solution. It's sustainable, market-based, and really well-positioned to help us meet global climate goals. And as Rebekah said, without asking consumers, to give up products they love or completely change their behaviors. Instead, we're focused on using alternative proteins. And when I say that, I'm talking about plant-based products like the Impossible Burger, but also products that are produced through fermentation and even cultivated meat, which for those not familiar, is actually cultivating animal muscle cells outside of the animal to produce animal meat, just without the need for raising livestock or slaughter, and all of the negative environmental impacts and externalities as Rebekah was discussing. So together, these three platforms really allow us to make the meat that consumers love, just in a better way. And ultimately, we're really working to make the climate friendly choice the default choice for consumers through our three key areas of work, which include corporate engagement, science and technology, and policy. So that's kind of a high level about GFI. To touch on the consumer sentiment piece, there's actually two articles about alternative proteins in the New York Times today. So you're talking just about both for the more kind of conventional land-based alternative protein products, but also one focusing on alternative seafood, with just massively increasing consumer interest in this space, right? And so we've reached the point where, these are no longer products for just vegans or vegetarians. And that's due both to kind of the game-changing innovation we've seen from Impossible Foods and other companies in the space, really looking to recapitulate meat from plant or through these other technologies, but often also shifting consumer needs and values and kind of the generational changes we're seeing with millennials and Gen Z in particular, and their concern about environmental choices. So, now we've got traditional meat eaters and flexitarians as the market for these products as well.
Absolutely. And Rebekah, I'm wondering what you're seeing as far as how consumer attitudes have shifted around this since Impossible launched, about a decade ago.
There's definitely been a pretty meaningful shift. I've been at Impossible for 5 years, and it's been apparent even in that time frame. So I think that shift has occurred kind of on two fronts. That first front is probably, and Caroline was alluding to both of these. The first front is consumer appetite for addressing sustainability in their purchase choice, addressing climate change and kind of how they make choices, and that has really increased. I'll credit a lot of that, I think, to youth movements starting around 2019. It has really reached kind of a peak in a way that it didn't until the past couple of years. So in marketing speak, sustainability credibility is moving consumers down that purchasing funnel, and it's bringing them back for repeat purchase, which is interesting. So if brands can communicate that, that's something that can add a lot of value. But the second front, and this is very specific to our sector, is that consumer awareness of what we internally call plate to planet is increasing. For decades, there's been a pretty low global awareness of the impacts of food and food categories on climate at the consumer level. And research has shown that about 1/3, like 30% or so of people can make that connection between, the category of food that's on my plate and the climate, there's a connection there. And we started getting really interested in this because we know that consumers are motivated by sustainability increasingly over the past couple of years. But if they don't know how to connect their choices and their wallets to their values, that's a huge opportunity gap for, mobilizing consumers for climate action. So we started doing some of our own research on this and found that two things seem to be happening. The first is that consumers are more likely now to be able to recognize that red meat is associated with very, very high emissions, exponentially higher emissions than any other food category. The second thing is that the consumers that know that or can recognize it at some level actually happen to eat less red meat in their diets. And that was huge for us, and it goes way beyond selling Impossible burgers. If we want to address climate change and extinction collectively, we've got to start educating consumers on what really moves the needle. And showing the trade-offs in choosing beef from cows is a big part of, I think, the action toolkit that we as a sector should start thinking about more.
Thanks so much for that rundown. I think that's super helpful for us all to just wrap our heads around where people's thinking is right now and how they're feeling about this. And as we look toward COP26 of this decade of action for addressing the climate crisis, I'm wondering what you all see as really the key action items for companies in the global food sector in order to really move some of these solutions forward. Caroline, I'd love to start with you and hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, as Rebekah alluded to, we won't be able to get to net zero emissions without addressing food and land, right? So the food sector has to be a part of the solution. And we believe, alternative proteins are really a key aspect of how we do that. So considering, portfolio compositions and making sure that brands are identifying opportunities to move into, alternative meat, egg, and dairy products. And also, right, food companies need to disclose greenhouse gas emissions, report science-based targets, and outline their progress towards those targets. And they really need to include scope 3 emissions. The nonprofit series actually just put out a report where they refer to these value chain emissions as the Achilles heel of the food sector. And they looked at about the top 50 food companies. I don't know exactly how they rated them, but they found only 19 of those even disclosed scope 3 emissions, and only 15 had science-based targets set.
Wow, that is a pretty stark disparity there. Rebekah, I'm wondering what you see as some of those action items. It's clear that we've got a long way to go when it comes to this sector, and that the sector absolutely does have a role to play.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much room for improvement. There's so many things we could be doing. One of, I think my personal pet peeves is within these dialogues, we have to start getting more specific, and we have to start getting more prescriptive. So when we talk about the emissions of agriculture, let's drill down one more level. Let's talk about animal agriculture and what percentage that constitutes. It is the vast majority. When we talk about deforestation, and we talk about deforestation from soy-driven deforestation is entirely to feed livestock. So these are things that we have to go down into the consumption level, the root cause, and get consumers into this equation in a way that we haven't. I'd also say that, and GFI has been a huge leader in this, more innovation in the supply chains for meat from plants, for other types of alternative proteins, finding ways to get a bigger, more robust toolkit to steer away from animal farming. And not just in rich countries. And that's the other thing I'd really double click on is there's been a lot of movement, a lot of investment in the global north. There needs to be more, I think, more broadly. And that is something that is emerging. I touched a little bit around kind of awareness building, consumer understanding of plate to planet. That is a big opportunity area. And, I think finally, I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for this, but within the NDCs, it would be great to see some policy determinations around this issue, but it does tend to be a tough one to get through in terms of policy.
Definitely, from the policy side, that's definitely what we've seen through the course of our reporting. But I love what you're saying here about specificity, because I think that that's such a huge issue in the sustainability space, right, in general, which already is a very broad term that could mean so many different things. So really talking about what it is, identifying the issues, and identifying those key action items, I agree, is so important for everyone. But just to quickly wrap things up with a real rapid fire last check-in here, but you're speaking to an audience of business leaders from all sectors. So I'm wondering what your top piece of advice might be for them as they're looking to take further action on climate change. Caroline, I'd love to start with you.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think it's really clear that more and more investors are acknowledging that climate risk is market risk, right? And actually, we know that some of the standard setting boards, in particular, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, has been evaluating standard setting activities in relation to alternative proteins for food and beverage companies. And I expect we'll see a lot more focus on this from investors and within the ESG space, not all too different from what we've seen in energy over the last several years. And a hedge fund we were recently speaking to, I might not get this quote exactly right, but said to us that, they believe the risk to companies of, and this is a huge hedge fund, of not offering alternative meat and dairy products is actually potentially fatal, given both changing consumer preferences and the need to decarbonize and to do so quickly, that traditional meat or dairy products could be left behind as stranded assets. So some pretty serious words to consider.
That's the first time I've heard the term stranded assets used to describe food products, but that's definitely super interesting. And, I wondered if we'll hear more about that. That's I'll have to look that one up, and everybody in the audience will all have to do the same. But Rebekah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about really what your big piece of advice is for business leaders out there.
That is a great report. If I'm thinking about the same one, it's definitely worth a read. I think my advice is this is solvable. We talk about doom and gloom, but it's eminently solvable. We just have to rally to do it. We have to address animal farming. We have to address and disrupt global demand for cattle products in particular. But especially luxury consumption in wealthy countries. We don't need to eat this, so let's not. Let's find other ways of feeding that demand. I don't think policy is going to do it. I don't think we're going to see every NDC start addressing this. So private sector is critical. If you as a business leader can connect your climate values to your procurement, to your employee sustainability communications, your carbon action plan, bring meat into the conversation. If you're still serving meat from cows and you have firm climate commitments, there's a lot of opportunity to start changing direction of travel here.
Well, thank you both so much for your perspectives. I think that, as you've both said, and if anybody gets anything from this today, I think that it's just really, these issues are solvable, but we have to identify them and we have to really take action. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us. This was really so great, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.